In a move that stunned the global markets and ignited outrage inside the White House, China has officially ordered its state-owned banks to cease purchasing US dollars. It's not just a technical adjustment. It's a declaration, a deliberate economic strike in the growing shadow war between two global superpowers. And President Donald J. Trump is livid. In the early hours of April 16, Beijing's Central Financial Authority issued a sweeping directive to halt all large-scale acquisitions of US dollars across major commercial and state-run banks. The immediate impact? Shockwaves across currency markets. The dollar dipped. Gold surged. And most importantly, Washington took it personally. President Trump, fresh off announcing sweeping 245% tariffs on Chinese imports, viewed the move as not just retaliation, but a direct challenge to America's financial supremacy. In a late-night post on X, formerly Twitter, Trump called the move economic sabotage and vowed to respond with unprecedented force. But behind the fury lies something deeper, a realization that China is no longer playing defense. It's making the first moves in what could become a full-scale currency war. China's move is more than just symbolic. It reflects a strategic pivot away from Western-controlled financial systems, and toward a parallel order where Beijing sets the rules. And for the US, a country whose global dominance has rested for decades on the dollar's role as the world's reserve currency, that is an existential threat. Inside Washington, Trump convened an emergency session with his National Economic Council, instructing aides to evaluate all options, from sanctions on Chinese banks, to restricting access to SWIFT, to calling on allies to blacklist Chinese firms using RMB as a trade currency. To Trump, this isn't just about China shifting financial gears. It's a power play, aimed at toppling the very system America built. And while Beijing hasn't fired a missile or rolled out a tank, this act, pulling away from the dollar, could have far more devastating long-term consequences. Because if China succeeds in pushing the yuan as a global currency, it rewrites the rules of global influence. And perhaps most concerning of all, other countries are starting to notice, and follow. This isn't a tariff spat anymore. It's not about trade deficits. This is about the future of money, of power, of who gets to control the pulse of the global economy. And right now, Xi Jinping just made his move. The question is, what will Trump do next? As the United States and China lock horns in an escalating financial war, one unexpected player has entered the arena, not as a mediator, not as a bystander, but as a new and eager economic partner to Beijing. That country is Spain. And its move is raising eyebrows and fury in Washington. In a highly publicized event last week, the Spanish government signed a sweeping series of economic agreements with China, including major investments in green energy, infrastructure, and technology transfer. The deals, hailed by Beijing as a new chapter of Euro-Asian cooperation, came just days after the US imposed harsh 245% tariffs on Chinese goods. For Washington, this wasn't just a deal, it was a provocation. President Trump responded within hours, calling the Spanish move short-sighted, naive, and a betrayal of the transatlantic alliance. In his words, "You cannot sit at America's table and eat from China's plate." To Trump and his advisors, Spain's pivot toward Beijing represents more than economic opportunism, it signals a crack in the once solid foundation of Western unity in the face of China's rise. In private briefings, White House officials are reportedly re-evaluating trade relations with Spain, and some GOP lawmakers are even floating tariff penalties for European nations that partner too closely with Beijing. To Beijing, Spain is more than just an energy partner, it's a strategic foothold. One that brings China closer to the heart of Europe, both geographically and diplomatically. And in the broader game of influence, that is an enormous victory. But this isn't the first time the US has felt blindsided by its allies. In 2024, both Italy and Greece signed infrastructure deals with China, drawing criticism but little consequence. Spain, however, is different, a NATO member, EU pillar, and historically aligned with US economic policy. Which is why Trump's reaction was so visceral. Spanish officials argue this is simply business, an economic lifeline, not a geopolitical alliance. But critics, including many in Washington and Brussels, see it differently. They see it as a crack in NATO's wall, and a win for Beijing without firing a single bullet. In choosing to shake hands with Xi, Spain has lit a fuse, one that could redraw alliances, reshape trade policies, and even reignite transatlantic tensions long thought dormant. The US sees betrayal. China sees opportunity. Spain sees survival. But what the world may be watching, is the beginning of a quiet fracture in the Western world order. Just days after President Trump stunned the world with 245% tariffs on Chinese imports, Beijing responded with surgical precision. On April 16, the Chinese Ministry of Commerce imposed retaliatory tariffs of 125% on a wide range of U.S. goods, targeting everything from tech hardware to agricultural products, from energy components to medical equipment. This wasn't just a trade move. It was a signal that China is not only prepared to defend itself economically, but is ready to play offense. Let's be clear, these 125% tariffs won't just hurt multinational corporations. They'll hit American farmers, tech exporters, medical suppliers, and energy producers, industries deeply tied to U.S. employment and already battling post-pandemic recovery headwinds. But more importantly, China's retaliation reveals something deeper. This is no longer a negotiation. It's a power recalibration. By striking sectors that are politically sensitive in swing states, like soybeans in the Midwest and semiconductors on the West Coast, Beijing isn't just targeting the U.S. economy. It's targeting Trump's political firewall. In years past, China might have responded more cautiously, seeking quiet diplomacy or targeted concessions. But under Xi Jinping, restraint is off the table. This is a new Beijing, emboldened by its alliances with Russia, Iran, and BRICS nations, and determined to lead a financial bloc no longer centered around Washington's rules. And while Washington still views China as a rogue player, China sees itself as the next global anchor. These tariffs aren't just economic countermeasures. They are policy statements, declaring that China will no longer absorb Western pressure without retaliation. This moment may be remembered not just as a turning point in the U.S.-China trade war, but as the formal beginning of economic decoupling between the two most powerful nations on Earth. 2 decades ago, China was the world's factory, reliant on U.S. demand. But today, it's a strategic empire, charting its own course, one that no longer bends to American pressure. With 125% tariffs now slamming U.S. exports, the question shifts from, can this be resolved? To, can the world survive what's coming next? The fallout from the U.S.-China tariff war is no longer confined to boardrooms or policy memos. It's now hitting the ground, and it's hitting hard, across industries, across borders, and across households. What began as political posturing has evolved into a full-blown global disruption, with ripple effects reaching everywhere from Silicon Valley to the American Midwest, and far beyond. In the United States, manufacturers are seeing input costs skyrocket. Products dependent on Chinese components, from solar panels to circuit boards to medical devices, are being delayed, redesigned, or outright cancelled. And in Silicon Valley, companies that once leaned heavily on Chinese manufacturing are now facing an ugly truth: there is no quick replacement. Apple, Intel, Tesla, Nvidia. Giants once protected by scale are now struggling to adapt to a world where parts don't arrive, export licenses are revoked, and global partners hedge their bets. It's not just inflation, it's dislocation. And while corporate profits take a hit, the blow lands harder on workers. But it's not just tech. In America's heartland, farmers are facing their worst season in years. Soybean exports to China, once a $14 billion market, have nearly collapsed overnight under Beijing's 125% retaliatory tariffs. Storage silos are full. Prices are down. Equipment loans are defaulting. For many, this is no longer a trade issue, it's a matter of survival. Meanwhile, in Europe, nervous allies watch the unfolding battle with growing unease. Germany and France, economic giants in their own right, are watching their export models tremble under the weight of disrupted supply chains. Their businesses face a choice: align more closely with the US, or look east, toward China's rising influence. And in developing nations, from Southeast Asia to Latin America, the chaos brings opportunity and danger. Some are benefiting from production shifts away from China. Others are bracing for collateral damage in an increasingly bipolar economic order. In financial markets, the impact is equally severe. Investors are fleeing high-risk equities, parking assets in gold, commodities, and digital currencies. The dollar, once the bedrock of global confidence, now faces external pressure from de-dollarization, and internal pressure from inflation and debt concerns. This isn't just a trade war. It's a global financial storm, ripping through industries, upending labor markets, and testing political alliances. And unlike the previous conflicts of the 20th century, this one isn't being fought with tanks or troops. It's being fought with spreadsheets, supply chains, and shipping lanes. And the casualties are already piling up. While tariffs dominate the headlines, a far more strategic battle is quietly unfolding beneath the surface. And it may well be the most dangerous piece of this entire conflict. China isn't just retaliating with taxes and trade bans. It's trying to do the unthinkable: dethrone the US dollar as the world's dominant currency. For nearly a century, the US dollar has sat at the center of global finance, used in 88% of all global trade, underpinning central bank reserves, and backed by unmatched military and institutional power. But China sees weakness in that foundation, and it's making its move. Step by step, China is building a parallel financial order. One where global trade is settled in yuan, not dollars. One where Chinese payment systems bypass SWIFT. And one where American sanctions have no reach. In the past year alone, China signed over 40 bilateral currency agreements to conduct trade in yuan. Major oil deals with Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Russia have been priced in RMB, a tectonic shift in energy markets long ruled by the petrodollar. BRICS nations have agreed to explore a shared digital settlement currency, with China at the center. To many in Washington, this was once a laughable idea, the yuan replacing the almighty dollar. But today, no one is laughing. Especially as China accelerates the use of its digital currency, the ECNY, in cross-border transactions, making it easier, faster, and more politically insulated than ever. And while the US debates over budget ceilings, rising inflation, and interest rate chaos, China is quietly offering the world an alternative. A currency not tied to military bases, but to manufacturing, infrastructure, and capital. But can China really pull this off? After all, trust is everything in currency. And while the yuan may be rising, Beijing's control over capital markets, censorship of financial data, and lack of legal transparency remain serious obstacles. Even close partners in BRICS are wary of replacing one dependency with another. China wants to lead a new order. But the world remembers how rigid and opaque that leadership can be. So can China truly replace the dollar? Not today. Maybe not even tomorrow. But for the first time in modern history, the world is preparing for that possibility. And that alone is enough to keep Washington up at night. We are living through the early chapters of a global transformation. Not written with treaties, but with tariffs, currency strikes, and quiet diplomatic betrayals. From Washington to Beijing, Madrid to Moscow. A new kind of war is underway, fought not with bullets, but with spreadsheets, semiconductor shortages, and supply chain sabotage. The rules are being rewritten. The currency we trust, the countries we trade with, the alliances we once assumed unbreakable, are now shifting beneath our feet. And as the US and China race to reshape the world in their image, every nation must decide. Which side of history will they stand on? Or will they try to write a new one? If this story opened your eyes, if you believe people need to understand what's really happening behind the headlines, Then don't just watch. Be the one who shares it. Bellhop bell, like this video. Subscribe for deep, global insights, delivered weekly. And drop a comment. Do you think China will succeed in replacing the US dollar? Or will America fight its way back? The global economy is changing. But one thing hasn't. You deserve to understand it. Stay smart. Stay curious. Stay with us.